Hello, my name is Dr. Yaya Sissoko. Today we're going to talk about chapter 6 with respect to taxes. The government can use taxes to raise revenue for public projects. The government uses taxes to pay for road, school, national defense, to build hospital, for instance. What is the tax incidence? The tax incidence is the burden of the taxes which must be paid by, all the participants in a market. For instance, a buyer will have to pay taxes, seller will have to pay taxes. If you work, you have to pay, income taxes. Figure 6 deal with a tax on seller. The government imposed the taxes on the seller. Before taxes, the market is in equilibrium at S1, where the supply curve crossed the demand curve D1 at this point, and the equilibrium price is $3, the price without taxes, and the equilibrium quantity is 100 ice cream cone. By imposing a tax of 50 cents on the seller, this will shift the supply curve upward from S1 to S2. So the new equilibrium will be where the new supply curve S2 cross D1 at this point, where the new equilibrium price is $3.30. This is the price paid the by the buyer. And at this new equilibrium, the new equilibrium quantity is 90, cone of ice cream. So the price received by the seller is $2.80 for the for the 50 cent taxes. So buyer pay, so 30 cents of the taxes to 330 minus $3.30, and then seller pay 20 cents of the taxes, $3 minus 280 equal to so 20 cents. So you can see that by imposing the tax on the seller, so price this increase the price of in the market, and then lead to higher prices, and then also lead to lower quantity sold in the market. But the burden of the tax is shared between buyer and seller. So how tax on seller affect market, outcome? Taxes discourage market activity by imposing, a tax burden on the buyer and the seller. Buyer pay more, they are worse off. Seller receive less, they are worse off. Overall, the effective price would fall. Figure 7 talk about the taxes on the buyer. The tax is imposed on the buyer. So before the taxes, the equilibrium without taxes is at this point where the demand curve D1 and the supply curve S1 cross. And the equilibrium price is $3. The price without taxes. The equilibrium quantity is 100 ice cream cone. By imposing a taxes on the buyer of 50 cents, the demand curve will shift downward from D1 to D2. So the new equilibrium with taxes will be where the supply curves S1 cross the new demand curve at this point. So at the new equilibrium with taxes, so the equilibrium price is $2.80. This is the price received by the seller, and the equilibrium quantity is 90 ice cream cone, which is a decrease from 100 to 90. So how do you recognize the price received paid by the buyer? So you go from the equilibrium, of the market with taxes. We go up on the graph all the way up to the demand curve to find the price paid by the buyer. The price paid by the buyer is $3, 30 cents. This is the price paid by the buyer. So, for the tax of 50 cents, in this case, buyer pay 30 cents taxes, $3, 330 minus $3, that's 30 cents. Seller seller pay 20 cents of the taxes, $3 minus 280, that's 20 cents. So the tax of the burden is shared between buyer and seller in that case. So how do taxes on buyer affect the market outcome? So buyer and seller share the burden of the taxes. So seller get a lower price, they are worse off. Buyer pay a higher price, market price, they are worse off. So the effective price with taxes rises. Let me ask you the following question. Can Congress distribute the burden of a payroll tax? So let's go through the process to see if this is possible. Payroll taxes are deducted from the amount that you earn. By law, the tax burden is pay half of the taxes is paid by the business firm out of the firm revenue. The other half is paid by the worker, so deducted from worker paycheck. Lawmaker from Congress, cannot legislate the true burden of taxes. The tax incidence will be determined by the forces of supply and demand in the market. So not necessarily the 50%, the 50-50 required by the law. Figure number 8 show a payroll taxes. So in this figure, labor supply and labor demand intercept at this point, which is the equilibrium without taxes. So that's a wage without taxes. By imposing a tax, so then there will be a tax wage. So then this will be the tax, wages, the wages receive the wage firm pay that will be this much, and the wages received by the worker will be that much. So then, but the true burden of the taxes, will, which is how much the firm pay and how much the worker receive, will depend on the shape of so the supply curve and the shape of the demand curve. In other words, it will depend how elastic or inelastic is the supply curve and how elastic is the demand curve. Now let's talk about how the burden of the tax will be shared among buyer and seller, elasticity and tax incidence. So if we are dealing with a very elastic supply and relatively inelastic demand, then seller will bear a smaller burden of the taxes, buyer will bear most of the burden of the taxes. So if we are dealing with a relatively inelastic, supply and very elastic demand, then seller will bear most of the tax burden, and buyer will bear a small burden of the taxes. Figure 9 deal with how the burden of a tax is divided among seller and buyer. Panel A to talk about elastic supply and inelastic demand. Let's begin with the initial equilibrium of the market where supply curve and demand curve cross at this point, and the equilibrium price is this price, the price without tax. So when supply is more elastic than demand, so then the buyer will have to pay this price as the price paid by the way, and this is the tax wage, and the seller will receive this price. The seller will receive this price. So because the supply is more elastic than demand, the incidence of the tax fall more heavily on the consumer. Buyer have to pay more of the taxes. You can see that the tax paid by the buyer is this much, which is represented by this one, and then the tax paid by the seller is represented by that much. So the seller pay less taxes than the buyer because supply is more elastic than demand. So in figure 9, panel B, we're dealing with inelastic supply and elastic demand. So again, the initial equilibrium of the market where supply curve and the demand curve intercept at this point, and we have the equilibrium price, the price without tax at this point. So when demand is more elastic than supply, then buyer will pay this price. So seller will receive this price, and then this represent the tax wage. So because the demand is more elastic than supply, the incidence of the tax fall more heavily on producer than on consumer. In other words, so a buyer paying only this much of the tax and seller pay more that much of the tax, which is greater than the one paid by the buyer. To sum up with the burden of the taxes, so the burden of taxes fall more heavily on the size of the market that is less elastic. This means that if the demand is less elastic, buyers do not have good alternative and of consuming that good, therefore they have to bear more of the burden of the taxes. If the supply is less elastic, then sellers do not have a good alternative of producing that good, therefore they have to bear more of the burden of the taxes. So who pay the luxury taxes? So in 1990, Congress adopted a new luxury tax on yachts, private airplane, furs, jewelry, expensive cars. The goal was to raise revenue from those who could, most easily afford to pay. So luxury item, so we know that the demand is quite elastic and the supply is relatively inelastic. So who do you think would pay for the burden of the taxes, the buyer or seller? So what is the outcome of this burden of the luxury tax? Burden of the luxury tax fall largely on the supplier because the supplier was relatively inelastic. Okay, you can see that so in this photo, so people were not happy because they said that if this boat were any more expensive, we could be playing golf. If they didn't have to pay the luxury tax on this boat, they could use that money to go play golf. Because of people were not happy, in 1993, most of the luxury tax was repealed in the US. This is the end of chapter 6.